Hello, and welcome to Listening to the Verde, a series brought to you by Friends of the Verde River. Friends of the Verde River works with people like you for a healthy, flowing Verde River system. This program is meant to inspire, engage, and inform you about everything that makes the Verde healthy: water, habitat, and community. I'm Tracy Stevens, Habitat Restoration Program Manager with Friends of the Verde River, and I'm here today with Kelly Mott Lacroix from the Tonto National Forest and Janie Agyagos with the Coconino National Forest. Welcome, ladies.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
We're here today to talk about Fossil Creek and the Backbone Fire. But before we get started on that, Janie, do you want to just give a quick introduction of yourself and talk a little bit about your background?
Sure. I'm a wildlife biologist on the Red Rock Ranger District of the Coconino National Forest. And when we have wildfires, I help with the wildlife and fisheries issues and values at risk during a fire. And I also participate sometimes on burn area emergency rehab teams, which we'll be talking more about later.
Great. How long have you been on the Red Rock Ranger District?
Since 1994.
Maybe I shouldn't have asked that question.
That
That's awesome. It's so great to know. You must have such great background information, so it'll be great to hear your thoughts on this. And then, Kelly, you're with the Tonto National Forest. What do you do on the Tonto?
Right, so on the Tonto National Forest, I am the Watershed Program Manager as well as the Forest Hydrologist. And then one of the other hats I wear on the forest is I am the Forest's Burned Area Emergency Response Coordinator. And so I was involved here as a hydrologist for the team, but also work on a lot of these bear assessments, which we're going to talk a little bit about today.
The bear team coordinator response, is that just primarily for the Tonto, or do you work?
Correct. So that is a role I play on the Tonto.
Okay.
Yes.
I imagine that you were quite busy with that this year, given the conditions.
Yes.
So as I mentioned, we're going to talk about Fossil Creek and get to the Backbone Fire, but I wanted to get a little background on Fossil before we start about the Backbone Fire. Fossil is one of two wild and scenic designated rivers in the state of Arizona, the Verde being the other. And so what are some of those values that make Fossil so significant? Janie, do you have some thoughts on that?
Sure. There's 4 outstandingly remarkable values that were identified for Fossil. One is the geology, specifically the travertine formations in Fossil. The second is recreation. The third are biological resources, populations, and habitat. And some of the rare species that we have in Fossil are 7 native fish species, blackhawks, yellow-bow cuckoos, Mexican spotted owl, and lowland leopard frogs. And then the last ORV, outstandingly remarkable value in Fossil, is the Western Apache and Yavapai cultural, their contemporary, and their historical cultural resources.
That's really interesting. Mm-hmm. Those are really important values to protect with Fossil. So when the Backbone Fire, which was in Fossil, could you talk a little bit about how and where and when that started?
Sure. So it started on June 17th. It was like a Wednesday, and it was a lightning strike on Ike's Backbone, which is down in kind of the Mazatzal Wilderness part of Fossil Wild and Scenic Corridor. And so it spread, a little bit east over to the Verde, very minor insignificant impacts to the Verde Wild and Scenic River corridor, but it also spread mostly north and eastward up towards the communities of Pine and Strawberry. They were actually on an evacuation order at one point. And then Camp Verde, it also moved northwards, 42,000 acres, so it was a big fire compared to just 3,000 acres in the Fossil Wild and Scenic Corridor. But it also moved towards Camp Verde, so Camp Verde was on a ready order to be ready to evacuate if necessary, which they never had to do.
That's fortunate. How long was the evacuation for the Pine and Strawberry communities? Do you remember?
I don't remember. 2 weeks?
I think it was at least a week.
Yeah,
it was at least a week, but it happened very quickly because, and one of the things we do, we have for our fire management trigger points that we set for our different communities in order to protect them. And so the fire very quickly passed that trigger point for evacuation of Pine and Strawberry within the first 24 hours.
Wow. How was the fire management handled? Was that handled primarily at the local level, or was there a bigger incident command team that was brought in for that fire management?
It started at the local level, but very soon went to a level
Type
1 team.
Yep.
And is that the highest level team?
It is, and it's generally the type of team we bring in when we have communities at risk.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it was really rugged terrain, not a whole lot of road access. And so really the majority of the fire was air suppression activities were air support. There were some on the ground crews that conducted burnout operations in different locations, but most of the work was done by air attack.
As the fire was being managed or controlled, you mentioned a lot of the outstandingly remarkable values as part of the Wild and Scenic River Plan. What special steps were put in place to try to protect those resources as the firefight was ongoing?
So the first thing that we were really worried about is the native fisheries in Fossil Creek and accidentally contaminating the native fisheries with non-native fish. So for the helicopters that were dipping water below the fish barrier, we had to very quickly get word to them not to dip water below and then fly over Fossil above the fish barrier, because if they dropped water that had eggs or fry or fish of non-native species, they would contaminate our fisheries that we've worked so hard to maintain since 2004. So that was one big effort. There were many efforts. There were burnout operations. There was mulching and mowing of shrubs up along Highway 260 to prevent this fire from crossing 260 and getting into the West Clear Creek area. There were lots of burnout operations along 260 and 87 to protect pine and strawberry. There was 14 miles of dozer lines. There were archaeological sites where there were plans to protection wrap those sites if needed, if the fire started getting close to the archaeology sites. What other things?
Oh, so one thing that bears mentioning here is on every fire, you're talking about the outstandingly remarkable values on Fossil, but regardless of if it's a wild and scenic river or what, we have a team of people who work with the fire organization called resource advisors. So everything that Janie's talking about was a group of resource specialists who work very hard, working closely with the Type 1 team to make sure that the fish are protected. They're the ones who are telling the firefighters, don't dip from here and take your water because you might contaminate there. These are the really important archaeological sites we may need to go and wrap. And so I can't remember any other specific...
no retardant within 200 feet of water.
Yeah.
That's a big no-no anywhere, on national forest lands. Just because of potential effects of the retardant on the water quality and the aquatic species in the water. Although nowadays the retardant is much better.
Than it used to be.
Yeah, and that might change in the future. We also had 4 archaeologists that were out ahead of all of our heavy equipment doing surveys to make sure our heavy equipment wouldn't go over a site, so they would direct them around sites. We had super scoopers, which are big airplanes that would go to Bartlett Lake and scoop up water, and they would go out ahead of the fire and wet all the vegetation in order to try to kind of keep it from spreading so quickly and so fast and furiously.
Yeah. So Kelly, you mentioned the resource advisors to advise the incident command team. Are those primarily local staff then?
They are almost... If local staff are available, they're preferably local staff because they know the resources best. I know of a couple of folks, I think it was predominantly local folks on the fire, but even if you're not local, when you're trained as a resource advisor, it's another role that I play on fires, so I know a little bit about it, but to go to that local resource, right? So if I went on to another forest to play that role, I would be going to the biologist, the archaeologist, and asking them to help me find those, figure out what's of concern.
That's good to know. That makes the most sense, it seems like, from the strategic efforts to make sure that things are being coordinated. And
it's preferable for sure.
Yeah. So as this fire was going on, it was the end of June of 2021, during the hottest part of our summer. How did that factor in as far as the firefighting efforts and what the crews were able to accomplish? I know you said a lot of it was aerial, but there were some on-the-ground efforts. How was that managed with those extra concerns?
There was minor on-the-ground stuff. There was some burnout operations and some line built around a ranch further north in the burn area, away from Fossil Creek, down about Hackberry Basin area. And there were some burnout operations that happened at night to, when fuel moistures are a little higher and the burnout operation wouldn't be so vigorous, and also to protect, firefighters from heat exhaustion and that kind of thing. But we did eventually start getting monsoon increased humidities and eventually some precipitation. So the fire was, considered contained and out, by July 14th, I believe, just shy of 1 month later.
Yeah, fortunately, we had a monsoon season this year. I know when the fire started in mid-June and watching that plume of smoke build from Fossil, it was very concerning because Fossil is such a special place. So as the monsoon storms started and those concerns as to what the impacts would be on Fossil then became the issue. So we had this fire. Obviously, managing the impacts of the fire was a priority, making sure that human health and safety was preserved and all of those resources and values, like the cultural resources, were protected. So then what are some of the next steps that we go into after that fire is declared out? Then what happens?
Right, so even before a fire is actually contained, usually at about 40 to 60% containment, if the fire is over 500 acres in the National Forest System, we have something called a Burned Area Emergency Response, or BEAR team, that gets assembled. And usually it's the BEAR coordinator on any forest is kind of part of the reason why you have that role, is to pay attention to all the different fires on the forest, and then you start to build your team based on the complexity. And what that team does is they go in and they assess a couple of different things. One of the most important is the soil burn severity, and that is basically how has the intensity of the fire impacted the soil structure and the vegetation in and around. But it's not necessarily just what the vegetation looks like, it's more about the soil. And then also they go in and they go hand in hand, they look at what the runoff is going to be. And they use those factors along with the values that we find, the critical values, like the wildlife that Janie can talk a little bit more about after the break, and our roads and all the different National Forest System resources to determine what the threat of flooding post-fire and erosion post-fire are going to be. And so those BEAR teams come on in every single fire that's under 500 acres. Either sometimes it's always a hydrologist and a soil scientist, but on a fire like this one, we have recreation folks, we have wildlife folks, hydro, soils. We actually had 4 people doing hydro and soils because we had some trainees, which was really great. And then archaeology, this was another one where the heritage resources were very important. So they go and they assess impacts to heritage resources. So really what's on your team, I've had teams where we actually have geologists on as well because we're worried about rock falls, or we have important cave resources. So it's all the different specialists that need to look at the post-fire impacts to the resource.
That's a great summary and information for those burned area emergency response teams. We're going to take a quick break, and then when we come back, we'll learn more about the BEAR team's recommendations and work on the Backbone fire. Welcome back to listening to the Verde. We're here with Kelly and Janie from the Tonto and Coconino National Forest to talk about Fossil Creek and the Backbone fire. Kelly, as we went to break, you were talking about a general overview of the Burned Area Emergency Response Team. With the Backbone fire and Fossil, who specifically was involved from the different forests as far as the specialists? It seems like with the values at risk here and the severity of the fire, that there was probably a fairly large and diverse team.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Tracy. So our team was actually led remotely by a very experienced hydrologist out of Montana, and he helped bring the whole team together, as well as our assistant team lead actually happened to be our national bear coordinator, because she wanted the experience to come and work a little bit in our region in Arizona. She wasn't as used to, she hadn't done a lot of work out here, so she wanted to get that experience of what the fires are like out here. So we had really about as experienced as you could get in terms of our team leads. And then everybody else who was on the fire was local in some way on the bear team. So it was about, most of the staff came from the Coconino. Myself, I served as their lead hydrologist, and I had one of the other hydrologists on the Coconino as one of my trainees. And then we were very lucky to have a retired soil scientist from the Coconino come on and help us, Roy Stanky, and he did just an amazing job. He also then trained a person in soils from the Tonto. So it was really this great combination of people. We had Janie doing the wildlife. We had Matt O'Neill doing the fish, because fish is one of those ones you don't usually have on a bear team, but because of the importance of fish in fossil. Matt joined us on the team. We had a series of folks working on recreation. Then we had also an engineer come down from the Apache Sitgreaves, so that was not entirely local, to help us out with the engineering aspect. And
Dowd, our archaeologist.
Yeah, and she had help as well from at least one or two other folks as well. So it was about as complete and big of a bear team as you would get, because of the size of the fire and honestly the importance of fossil as a wild and scenic river.
I feel like that was really fortunate to be able to have that diverse and such an experienced team, to bring people in from a national level and also locally to combine the knowledge and experience is, I think, a great, we were really fortunate in the area to have that. So once the bear team is assembled, what were some of the steps that you all went through as far as making your assessments?
So the first part of any bear assessment is to verify, you request something called a BARC, which is a burned area reflectance classification, and that is actually from satellite imagery that they take before the fire. They take from a pass that came before the fire and then a pass that came after the fire. And that change in the satellite imagery is what gives us the first estimation of the thing I was talking about before, that soil burn severity. So we get that BARC image, and we were super fortunate on this fire that we had a clear day when the satellite came over and we got our BARC image immediately, because a lot of the fires that have happened in Arizona this past year have not been that fortunate, and they had to wait for the next satellite pass. And so once we have that BARC image in hand, the hydrologist and the soil scientist mostly go out and verify it. So we go into the field, we look at places where it says, okay, this is the satellite imagery tells us that this is unburned or this is low. So soil burn severity is in 4 categories: unburned, low, moderate, and high. And so we go out into the field and we do tests of the soil. We look at, is the soil something called hydrophobic, which means is the soil repelling water. We look at whether or not there's still little bits of roots left in the soil, all of these things to kind of indicate what the soil burn severity is. So we're validating that map. And once we have enough data points that we've collected, we use that to refine the satellite imagery and get a soil burn severity map. Concurrently, while the hydrologists and the soil scientists are doing this, folks like Janie are out looking at their critical resources. So visiting the different sites where there's archaeology or endangered species and trying to see how did the burn look around them, what might be the risk to these critical values. If there's the rec folks go and look at, recreation sites. Are they in a place where there's a lot of trees that are going to fall, just trying to understand what their critical values are. We then come all together as a team once the other specialists have identified their critical values and the soil scientist has done the soil burn severity map. Actually, take a step back. They do the soil burn severity map and then they give it to the hydrologists, and we go out and we take that data and we use it to build models to predict how much the runoff is going to change pre and post fire. And it's one of these things when you're on a bear team where as a hydrologist, everybody is always waiting for you, right? So you have to wait for the soil scientist to get finished, and then you get your stuff in, And everybody, literally, like, I swear on every fire, people are literally like breathing over my shoulder, being like, "What's it look like, Kelly? What's it gonna be?" Anyway, so then, we, as quickly as we can, we build models. On this fire, I did mostly something called a HEC HMS model, which is a U.S. Army Corps of Engineer model, which allowed me to take a look at the entire watershed in and around Fossil Creek all at once, which was really nice. Then we predict how much the erosion's going to change, the runoff's going to change. We then meet as a big team, and sometimes these meetings take, a day or 2 days, and we systematically go through every single resource, and then what is the threat to those resources based on the modeling that we've done. And then once we've done that, we then come back together as a team and we talk about, okay, what are the unacceptable risks to these resources, and is there anything we can do to mitigate those unacceptable risks? Are there actions that can be taken? And sometimes that action is simply, we're going to close the area, and sometimes there's something more active we can do.
That's a really interesting overview of everything that goes into the assessment of these fires after through the burned area. Janie, Kelly mentioned the work on threatened and endangered species, and I know you had mentioned some sensitive species as well. So what were some of the species and concerns with this fire that you all were analyzing as you move forward with this?
In the BEAR effort, we only look at threatened and endangered species, so not other special status species like Forest Service sensitive and things like that. So the listed species that we had that we were really concerned about are various fish species in Fossil Creek. We also have the yellow-billed cuckoo that nests, that it has been detected down along Fossil Creek at Sally Mae and Homestead, and a lot of that foraging habitat for the bird burned up, and the riparian vegetation was, kind of fried from radiant heating, and so we had a lot of loss of habitat for the cuckoo as well. And then outside of the fossil corridor, further north, we have Chiricahua leopard frog, which is a listed frog in a couple sites, and so we had just asked helicopters not to dip from those sites or to fly over those sites with water that might have non-native aquatic organisms in the dipped water from another site. So those were the main species that we had.
Okay. So as you're assessing these risks, what were some of the findings from the backbone fire and the burned area response team? What were some of the recommendations at the end of the team?
So we, the soil burn severity really helped us determine that, and the modeling based on the soil burn severity helped us determine where we had acres that were even maybe suitable to do any kind of treatment. And by treatment, we mean things like mulching and wattles and things like that. So there were a couple archaeology sites that really needed protection via mulching and straw wattles. We thought there was a Chiricahua leopard frog that might need protection, but upon getting out there and looking at where the ash was and how it was flowing, we determined that wasn't needed. But there were quite a few things that we've looked at for fish. So for the native fisheries, we are posing to have materials staged down in Fossil Creek ready to build a temporary fish barrier in case any non-native fish were moved upstream. And so the way we'll know that, because we can't really be in the water, it's very opaque still from sediment. We can't even see fish. We can't even see if there are fish because the water's so turbid. But also, it's just unsafe for our folks to be snorkeling in Fossil. But so one way we're doing that is by filtering water, and we send that filter to a lab, and they test that filter for DNA of non-native fish species. So that's one way we're looking to see if we might need to contain non-native fish by building a temporary fish barrier. There were other actions too, like we are doing storm patrols and trying to maintain our roads the best we can. We had many places along the roads that were closed because sediment came down, filled up culverts, and then that sediment washed over the road and blocked the roadways. We had power lines down along one roadway. So that's a big part, is to get our roads back open so we can get in there and do things. Needing to pump 2 toilets that are out of the 100-year flood zone but close to it. Let's see, there are some other things.
Well, and so part of the findings, which we haven't mentioned yet, which I think is important for folks to understand, is when you have a burned area, right? It's not all moonscape across the entire area, right? And so we generated that soil burn severity map, and among that the 42,000 acres, about 10% was actually completely unburned. Another 54% was low burn, so that's the stuff that's going to come out back quite quickly. Then about 34% was moderate, and only 2% was high. And when we look at doing treatments, you generally are doing treatments in the areas that are moderate and high soil burn severity, because low soil burn severity, you don't really need treatments. It's going to come back pretty quickly. So that's just one thing I wanted to mention.
Right.
And then the other thing that we found in our findings from our assessment that also played into some of the work that Janie was talking about is that most of the threat to the fossil corridor was south of where the Boulder Canyon drainage comes in. Up above that, while there were some higher areas of moderate and high soil burn severity, the Boulder Creek drainage really had a lot of moderate and a high in it, and so that's the place where we were most worried about downstream effects to fossil, was from that point down. And then now I just kind of lost where we were.
That's okay. We were talking about things that
I just want to make sure we talked about that.
Yeah, that's great.
So the Bear team made these recommendations, and we had to get our recommendations in within 6 days, I believe.
Within 7 days of containment.
7 days of containment.
Yeah.
So it's a very fast process. We worked really long days. But other things that we talked about was monitoring and treating invasive weeds, specifically yellow bluestem along Highway 260 and 87, where burnout operations took place, and also Himalayan blackberry, which is in the Fossil Springs botanical area, and is overtaking a lot of the native vegetation, and we don't want fire to increase that blackberry, so we'll be monitoring that and doing some treatments on blackberry. And then also rain gauges.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. So one of the things we recommended here, and we received funding for, I don't know if Janie mentioned or not, but we've been authorized $195,000 to spend in terms of the emergency response. And this is just mitigating the emergency, right? None of this is money for rehabilitation per se. That would come later and from different, the forest's own funding sources. But we wanted to install these rain gauges, which will help us understand how the changes in precipitation that occur over the next year correlate to the changes in the flow on fossil, which will help us better understand when the emergency has passed to folks that recreate within the Fossil Creek corridor, because we don't want people in there while we still have really heightened flood risk, because it would be very, very dangerous. So we're going to try to use this as a little bit of a novel approach to figure out when it might be safer to reopen, or safe really to open up fossil.
And we're thinking that could be even into after next fall, after next monsoon season.
Correct.
So, but it will be based on monitoring, so we can't say for sure. But there's a lot of risk from not only flash flooding, but from debris flows, from rock falls, from entrapment on roads where roads get closed from boulders and stuff coming over and trapping people down in there. So we really have to be careful about who we allow in the area, and there's some pretty strict regulations. So we have to check in, check out if we're going in to do work, and we have to be out by 1 because of the monsoon, potential for monsoon activity and flooding. So there's, it's pretty strict on who can go in right now, and it's based on implementing these Bear efforts.
Yeah, and just to close, one other thing that we're doing to monitor is we're going to look at over the next year those rain gauges, as well as how the soil and vegetation is recovering. And so once we see adequate recovery of the soil and the vegetation, as well as the hydrology, it'll help us be more certain about when it's safe to let folks back into the Fossil Creek corridor.
I really appreciate that update, and I'm sure that our viewers do too, as a lot of people are very concerned, and it's such a special place, and people really enjoy recreating there. And I think learning about the impacts of the fire and then the changes due to the monsoon storms and the safety concerns there is so important for people to understand. And you all have mentioned the recovery, and I just was wondering if you might have a takeaway message for folks, Janie, that from what you've seen on the ground.
Yeah, so we have, we kind of think of impacts in terms of short, moderate, and long term. And so the short term impacts are some that I already described about, some of the radiant heating of the riparian vegetation and some loss of riparian trees. Those are very resilient systems. They're going to recover. New trees are going to grow, and it's going to happen very fast. We think 3 to 5 years we're going to have, pretty good recovery of our riparian and our upland species. the very resilient systems. But in the short term, we have a lot of sediment in the channel, and so much so that in big, deep pools have been filled with sediment. And that sediment covers all of the gravels and the cobbles and the boulders, and those spaces that sediment has covered is where macroinvertebrates attach. So we really have lost, will have a big impact to our macroinvertebrate community, not only in the short term and midterm, but until the big floods come. After all the sediments coming down from the watershed, we'll need big floods to come to kind of wash out the sediment and get fossil back to pre-fire sediment levels in the pools, and to open that up. So, and we do expect that we probably had fish loss downstream of Boulder. The water's very turbid. We haven't been seeing fish, but we have seen fish above there, and we believe that those fish above are refugia and are a source population to recolonize downstreams after the system settles out with all the sediment. So long-term effects are more in terms of sediment and the fish and the macroinvertebrates, but really in terms of vegetation, it's more midterm, 2 to 5 years.
Yeah, ultimately it will look different, but it will come back, and it will be a healthy system again.
That's great to hear, and we're all looking forward to the opportunity to go and see the changes and visit Fossil again, since it is such a special place. Janie and Kelly, thank you guys so much. This was a wonderful discussion, and I've really learned a lot, and hopefully our viewers have too. That wraps up our Listening to the Verde segment. For more, you can visit verderiver.org/listening. Thank you so much.
Listening to the Verde is brought to you by Friends of the Verde River. Please visit verderiver.org/listening for more videos and resources.